Hey everyone, I'm a bit shaken up right now because I'm in the middle of the last argument of kings. Holy Mother of Christ is all I'm going to say on that, and we'll talk more about it later. I'm just like, so how's everyone doing? I hope you all have tickets to Evil Dead. I am going to see it it's the 20th. I'm going to see it tonight. How was it, future self?
Thanks, past me. The movie was excellent. Definitely check it out if you are a horror fan or more specifically an Evil Dead fan. It was very nasty, but very good.
Just as I suspected. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about A Song of Ice and Fire. This is a series that is extremely significant for me, as it is with many people. Of course, this is probably, next to Lord of the Rings, the most popular adult fantasy series out there. Much of it in part to the HBO show, but also some of it in part to it being absolutely incredible. And instead of like a normal review, because pretty much everyone knows what's up with this one, I kind of just want to tell my whole history with this series, because it goes way back. So A Song of Ice and Fire is, of course, a grimdark fantasy series that was written by George R.R. Martin. It consists of 5 books total, a handful of novellas, and some bonus books. It began in the mid-90s, and despite not having a new entry in over a decade, still technically continues to this day. We follow a large cast of characters in this fantasy world of Westeros. It has politics, action, amazing character development, crazy wild twists. We all know A Song of Ice and Fire, and even if you have not gotten into it, you probably still know a lot about it. And why is that? So this was a popular series as it was coming out. It was very acclaimed, won a lot of awards. But there's always like a barrier when it comes to adult fantasy series. Like, you look at the most popular ones from today, whether that be The First Law, the Stormlight Archive, they're very popular in a certain circle, but in the grand scheme of things, Colleen Hoover curb stomps them all. But A Song of Ice and Fire is a series that has not only completely broken into the mainstream, but just become a huge powerhouse. And a lot of this can of course be contributed to 2011's Game of Thrones, a show that ran for 8 seasons that was all about adapting George's work. And this show, to call it massive was an understatement. I mean, it only still ended a few years ago. It's still very massive, still very fresh in everyone's minds. And being a child who used the internet, I of course heard about it pretty soon after it had started. But of course the problem is that when it started, I was, I think, 13. Probably a good thing that I did not check it out at that point. But as the years passed, the show would only grow in popularity, with increasingly positive word of mouth spreading all around, convincing everyone and their mom to watch it, including like my mother, who would literally never watch a show like this ever. And I think it was during the off-season gap between 3 and 4 when I first got into this series. I believe that would have been 2013. Which would have made me 15 years old. Which is probably a good age to start this series, because I feel like any younger and a lot of it might go over your head. But let me tell you, man, I was in love with this thing. My family did not have HBO during this time, so what I would do is I would go onto Google Incognito, because I thought that somehow, prevented viruses, and I would just watch it on some really sketchy site full of ads. And despite the low quality and constant buffering, I was absolutely hooked on this thing. Game of Thrones was like nothing I had seen before. And honestly, there wasn't much else like it. Fantasy shows in general weren't very common, and none of them were pretty much on the level of Game of Thrones in both, its production design, its large scale, and of course its quality storytelling. And that can be directly attributed to the first half of the show following George's books very faithfully. Now, this happened during my manga phase. At this point, I had no desire to read the books. Why would I when the show is apparently adapting them so well? And they really did do a fantastic job with it, Obviously not everything that was great about the books made it into the show, but as far as shows go, the first half of Game of Thrones is pretty much some of the best stuff you'll ever watch. I still find myself rewatching earlier clips of this show, because it is just so fantastic. And everyone thought so too, man. All my friends also slowly started to get into it, and all throughout high school, it felt like just the entire world was watching. The excitement for this thing online and in my real life was absolutely absurd. When it was airing, I would watch it with my mom and my stepdad. My mom sort of mortified that I was watching this. And once we got into like seasons, 5, 6, and beyond, I would always get together with my friends every Sunday night to watch the show. And those are some very, very fun memories, because this show, it knew how to please an audience, man. Now, in retrospect, once season 5 starts, there is a very clear decline in the show's writing quality, and we'll talk about why. But at the time, no one really seemed to care, because everyone just loved getting together and watching this crazy, crazy show with all of these characters we had grown to love or hate. And even when, the show was off, I mean, the hype train did not stop at all. There's a Game of Thrones edition of the game Risk, and I would literally, me and my friends would play it during our lunch breaks at school. Everyone was just so into it. It wasn't just us, the nerds, who would be into that stuff. It was literally everyone. But you see, the state of the franchise was in a bit of a weird spot at this point, because, of course, the series had been adapting George's books, of which there were 5 out at the time. The 5th one came out the year that the show started. I believe HBO and pretty much everyone else, including George, was under the impression that more books would come out for the show to follow. But I think we know what happened. It became very clear at a certain point that the 6th book, The Winds of Winter, was not coming out anytime soon, and the show had to continue. So when it came to season 5, which was getting to the content in A Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons, they had to make some decisions. So we sort of saw this season, while it did follow those books to an extent, because the show had to continue at this point without the books, they started to do their own things with it, and there were certain parts where the books left off, and they sort of went a bit beyond that. And this continued into season 6. Now, these 2 seasons are, generally well regarded, though most people often consider them weaker than the first 4. Without George's outline, you could really tell that the writers might not have had a clue, but they were connected enough to the original source material, and the events that happened in the season, made enough sense, when you see what's happening in the books. A lot of this stuff was still probably just about to happen in the books, and we were all still along for the ride. You had Hardhome, the Battle of the Bastards, the whole Sept thing. I remember the week the Battle of the Bastards came out, I was graduating high school, and we did the whole thing where everyone lined up, you went onto the stage to get your diploma. I remember waiting there, and one of my teachers came up to me and just started chatting about it. That was an event for the ages, it really was. Now, you see, the interesting thing about 5 and 6 is that I think they were sort of designed where that if The Winds of Winter came out during their production, they could still probably course correct and get back on the path of the books. But again, once they got past season 6, it became clear yet again that this book was not going to be coming out soon. So they just said F it and decided to end the show with 2 more shortened seasons, which was a bit of a confusing move when it was announced, because HBO wanted more seasons. Obviously, it was their biggest show in history. George thought they needed a lot more seasons to fully adapt what he had in mind, even though no one seemed to know what he had in mind. Could it have had something to do with Benioff and Weiss, the showrunners, getting a Star Wars deal and then wanting to move on, perhaps? Why not just find new showrunners? Anyway, seasons 7 and 8 suck. But it wasn't immediately clear. Season 7 still had a lot of goodwill from the first seasons, and a lot of hype behind it. It still had its moments. It still had its huge crowd-pleasing moments. And while me and my friends started to notice cracks in the writing, we were still along for the ride. Everyone had sort of accepted now that the series was going to end, likely much different from how George had envisioned. But, they've just put so much effort into it up to this point. How could they mess it up? I don't think I need to say much about season 8 of Game of Thrones. It has already been said extensively. There's so much content just talking about how awful it was, how it destroys every character, how nothing makes sense. Yeah, it is probably one of the most baffling television moments in history, and just slowly realizing it over the course of those last 6 episodes. The hype was pretty high at the start, but with each episode, we realized, oh my god, this is going to go down in history, and not for a good reason. And for what? Well, nothing. Benioff and Weiss lost their Star Wars deal. So yeah, one of the best pop culture rides of the past decade really went out with a whimper. But it's actually kind of important to this whole thing I'm doing here. This is sort of what got me back into reading books. As I said before, I was into manga for a very long time. All throughout my time of following the show, I was like a manga only guy. I didn't want to check out the books because I'm like, hey, I'm a show watcher. Yeah, screw that nerdy stuff. But once the show ended, I decided, you know what? Maybe I'll give it a go. They're big books. It'll take me a while. Maybe I'll take a really long time going through them all, because then by the time I am caught up, Winds of Winter might be out. So I began reading A Game of Thrones, and I absolutely loved it. I think this book is phenomenal. The downside of, reading this whole thing after watching the show is that I knew most of the big events and the stuff that was going to happen, but the quality was just so high, I didn't really care. Despite its length, I think there is a reason why this series has become so popular since the show broke out into the mainstream. It's because it's honestly very accessible. Yes, there's a lot to learn at first, but if you're coming over from the show, you already have a lot of the knowledge needed, and George really knows how to hook the reader. Like, they're very, very engaging stuff. And I basically just read one a year. That was 2019. I read A Clash of Kings in 2020, Storm of Swords in 2021, which I think is the best book in the series, but definitely one of, probably my top 3 favorite books of all time. Last year, I read A Feast for Crows and half of Dance with Dragons, and you know what? I'm still not actually done A Dance with Dragons. It'll happen this year, though. And does it look like Winds of Winter will be out next year? No. In fact, let's talk about that now. What's been going on with that silly little book? Of course, the past decade saw George becoming busier than he has ever been, which, isn't always easy for someone now in their 70s. But even so, over a decade is a bit much, man. Especially with pressure from, pretty much everyone, the entire world, to continue the series. And he just really didn't seem to be doing much work on it. Now, whether that be, lack of motivation, writer's block, just wanting to see how everything blew over, I have no idea. Everything I've ever seen from George makes him seem like a swell guy. And I'm not one to complain about this, really. I think he's given us some amazing stuff, and he doesn't really owe us anything. If he just wants to retire, never write a word again, honestly, I wouldn't really care. But, as a fan of the series, it was, a bit upsetting that, there was just nothing coming out and no news at all. However, since COVID happened, we have actually been getting some updates on the writing front. Now, there's a video I'm going to point you to where someone sort of analyzed everything George has said about the Winds of Winter over the years and concluded that it's very, very likely, to the point where I pretty much believe this, that George wrote a good chunk of this book, right away after Dance with Dragons, and then did not write anything for a very long time. Because once COVID happened and he was sort of forced to just stay in his office all day, it's when we finally actually started to get updates from him about the book. To the point now, in the last update we have gotten, he predicts that he is about 3/4 of the way through the book. There are many naysayers out there who say, Winds of Winter is just never coming. I disagree. I am a Winds of Winter truther, okay? Here's the situation we're in now. If George is to be believed, and I genuinely do think he is, we're looking at 800 pages minimum of content. That's a full book right there. That's longer than some of the others. Worst case scenario, God forbid, the man is old, he dies tomorrow. That book's coming out, man. That we're gonna get the Winds of Winter. I don't know if George has anything in place, any instructions for if this was. I imagine he does. He's old. Again, God forbid. I hope the man lives to be 102. But being realistic here, whatever happens, we're getting Winds of Winter. Unless he's been completely lying about this whole thing and doesn't have anything written. I do believe that the winds are real. The problem is what comes next. Obviously, A Dream of Spring, the proposed final book in the series. Fire and Blood is a book he came out. This is a Targaryen history book that came out, I think, in 2018. Fans were a little bit bitter that we got this instead of Winds, but you know how it is. Did you guys know it's getting a part 2? I did not know that for a while, until I recently found out, and oh, George, you silly goober. How about these novellas, the 3 novellas here? Do you know he's planning 5 more? He's got 5 more to come out. Man, what I'm getting at is that if George wants to do all of these things, he can't take a break this long ever again. So while I am a Winds of Winter truther, I genuinely have no idea what's going to happen after that. Especially now that COVID is, well, not over, but over. And George seems to be fully back on the TV production train with multiple spin-offs in development. I do not know what's going to happen. I hope that the shows continue to be good because, of course, despite the ending of Game of Thrones, we've of course seen The House of the Dragon come out in the past year. And this really reminded everyone what was so great about the original show. It was a huge return to form. And, if the rest of that show and the other upcoming shows can, keep this general quality, I think fans of Westeros will still have a lot of content to enjoy in the coming years. Whether or not it's from George or not. I have a huge amount of respect for the series, and whatever happens, I'll be there for it. Thank you all for watching. You can leave your thoughts on this series in the comments down below. Next up we have the manga video and the First Law video. I don't know which one will come first. We'll have to see. Now it's Evil Dead time, baby. Let's go.